So let's begin. When talking about gender integration in agricultural development programs, we're going to try and address three questions. The first, what is gender? The second, why do we need to integrate gender into agricultural development? And the third, how should it be done? Let's begin by first clarifying some of the main terms in the language of gender and development. The first is the term sex versus gender. They are often used interchangeably, but do they mean the same thing? Sex refers to the biological differences between males and females, such as one's anatomy or genetic differences. We all have the same structure, more or less, but there are some differences. For example, our genitalia, or the hormonal, the types and levels of hormones that our body secretes. Gender, on the other hand, is not biological. Gender is cultural. Sex being the physical difference between male and female sex, they are different because they have different bodies. Women can have babies, for example, and men can only help them do that. Gender, on the other hand, is the different roles that men and women play in our society. These roles are not the same everywhere in the world, but most cultures do attribute different roles to women and to men. The World Health Organization defines gender such. Gender refers to the socially constructed characteristics of women and men, such as norms, roles, and relationships of and between groups of women and men. It varies from society to society and can be changed. Many of these roles originate from the sex differences between men and women. For example, men tend to be physically stronger, so they therefore have been traditionally assigned roles that require more physical strength. Women bear children, breastfeed, and are therefore usually the primary caregivers, at least in the first few years of a child's life. Let's do a short exercise, please. I'd like you to complete the following, fill in the blanks in your mind. A real woman is, a real woman always, a real woman never. Okay, let's do the same for men. Okay, a real man is, a real man always, a real man never. Okay. Is this what you imagined? Tell me. Is this? This is a portrait of King Louis XIV wearing his trademark heels in a 1701 portrait by Rigaud. Here you can see that Louis XIV, the king, certainly a trendsetter, is wearing high heels, a wig, and stockings. Is this how men are expected to dress today? Is this how men dress? Is this an acceptable dress for men in your society? I don't know, but this brings us back to the definition of gender. And then again, these are socially constructed characteristics. And also, they can be changed. Gender encompasses so much more than just a person's sex. It encompasses the meaning that we attribute to being a man or a woman in our society. Words such as masculinity, femininity, words such as womanhood, manhood, male role model, female role model, father figure, feminism, mother nature, alpha males, cooperation, control. A woman's place, how many times have you heard that term? Things like female stereotypes, male stereotypes that exist in the society, words like power, patriarchy. Gender norms reinforce certain stereotypes, for example, those of women being nurturing, weak, or acting on emotion rather than reason, especially in comparison to their male counterparts. While these attributes in themselves are not inherently negative, their implications can be. For example, when a woman is forced to choose between being a mother and having a career, or when she is expected to serve coffee in an office meeting, or what most often is seen when she is expected to take the unpaid household role of homemaker, including round-the-clock childcare. Naturally, part of the nurturer role is to prepare and serve food for the family, even for women who work or have careers outside of the household. In this case, it becomes clear that gender norms are not harmless or imagined things. Another term is gender identity, because from the moment we are born, we are told what we are allowed to do, what we are expected to do, and what we are encouraged to do or to be. From our earliest infancy, we are going through a process called socialization. Socialization means that we are dressed in a certain way, given certain toys, for example, cars to boys, or balls, or building blocks, and dolls and tea sets to girls. How many times have you heard these following phrases? For a girl, you are so pretty. What a nice dress you have. Oh, what a doll. For a boy, how many times? Oh, you are so clever. You are so strong. A girl, throughout her childhood, might be expected to be useful around the house or to help her mother. Boys, on the other hand, are allowed and even expected to be more wild, climb trees, be active, be strong. How many times have you heard the term, boys don't cry? All of this socialization intensifies throughout our adolescence, and at the end of the process, we emerge as adults ready to assume the roles that society has attributed to us. But what is the problem? The problem is that gender roles often determine the differences in our access and control over resources. They spell out power relations between women and men, and more often than not, they reveal the underprivileged status of women in various sectors. One thing that almost all human societies have in common is the inequality, the gender inequality factor. I would give you an example from Israel. In Israel, for example, women earn on average 32% less than men in terms of global salaries. There are four main factors contributing to this. First, the number of hours being worked. Okay, so fair, if you're working more hours, you should be paid more. But what is happening? What is happening is that, as we know, many women must leave work on time to pick up the children from daycare, from kindergarten, from school, or at least to be home there when the kids get home. The second factor is that the average salaries in women-dominated sectors, such as caregivers, education, and administration, are the lower-paying jobs on average. The third factor is that there are far less women in higher-paying top management positions. Finally, the fourth one is that women are often skipped over for pay raises because employers tend to think that a woman is not the main breadwinner of the family. In other words, that her salary is just an extra that is nice to have, when in reality, this is not necessarily the case. Okay, so let's calculate it on an hourly wage basis. Then what is there a disparity? And the answer is yes. In Israel, calculated on an hourly basis, the pay gap between men and women is 16%. We have a saying in Hebrew. The saying is, Bal ha'me'ah, Bal ha'de'ah. This means, loosely translated to English, is that he who pays the piper calls the tune. And that is, in other words, that money equals power. Economic power equals decision-making power. And this is what women often lack. What is going on? We are stuck in a gender cycle. Again, from birth, our gender roles are socially determined. These gender roles in turn influence the gender division of labor. Labor is then valued differently based on who does it. Then we have different access to resources, decision-making services and benefits. And this lack of access and lack of decision-making power all adds up to supporting the existing power relations, thereby reinforcing the gender roles. And again, and again, and again. So the second question is, why should we integrate gender in agricultural development projects? What's the connection here? And the answer is very simple. We cannot address poverty without addressing gender, and we cannot address poverty without addressing agriculture. Agriculture being the source of life for humanity and often the backbone of a country's economy. So in order to address poverty, we must address gender and agriculture. Our goal, ultimately, is for men and women to benefit equally from development. And when we look at gender equality, the gender equality factor, here we go, the gender equality factor, and when we look at the other sustainable development goals, we can see that gender equality and the equitable distribution of resources has a positive multiplier effect for a range of key development goals, including poverty reduction, elimination of hunger, and the welfare of children in terms of education, health, and nutrition. If that isn't enough of a reason, let me share some more facts with you. Half of the farmers in the developing world are women. Approximately 70% of economically active women in least developed countries work in agriculture. Women carry out up to 90% of the processing, threshing, drying, winnowing, peeling, grading, sieving, and so on. And they conduct 60% of the marketing. They provide about 80% of labor to transport and store agricultural produce. In Asia, women perform 90% of rice labor, and yet, when women perform 2/3 of the world's work, they earn only 10% of the world's income. This is the feminization of poverty. Let me share some more statistics with you. In sub-Saharan Africa, women comprise only 20% of landholders, but they own only 1% of the land. Women receive worldwide only 5% of all agricultural extension services. Women work an average of 20 hours more than men per week. This is from the FAO Stat 2012. Also, 2/3 of the illiterate people in the world are women. 1 out of 3 women in Africa of childbearing age is anemic. Maternal mortality in sub-Saharan Africa is the highest in the world, reaching 6 to 15 deaths per 1,000 births. 30% of households are headed by women, yet these heads of households are rarely recognized as actual heads of households in various respects. Over 2/3 of the world's 793 million illiterate adults are women. And in certain areas of sub-Saharan Africa, 1/3 of the men and half of all women are illiterate. And yet, women provide food and nutrition security for their families. Women, relative to men, spend more on food for their family, and women's incomes are more strongly associated with child health and nutrition. This is from FAO infographics, and here we see that an increase in only $10 of a woman's income provides the same effect and improvement in child's nutrition and health as an increase of $110 in a man's income. Further, research has shown that gender norms are a major constraint to agricultural productivity. Addressing gender in agricultural projects can increase sustainability by at least 16%. And we know that if women had the same access to agricultural resources as men, yields could increase by up to 30%, and the number of hungry people around the world reduced 12 to 17%. So now, I'd like to know how. How should we integrate gender into agricultural development programs? So I ask you to please put on your gender lenses, and I will explain. So first of all, before we discuss specific strategies that may be employed, a few words about the difference between equality and equity. A lot of people are confused about these two terms, and I think this is the moment to clarify some things. When we talk, as I said, our goal is to ensure that men and women benefit equally from development. And you may have noticed that in this talk, I am referring almost exclusively to women and women's constraints. And in a few moments, I will also be talking about some strategies designed for overcoming some of those constraints. So some of you may think that this is a talk about women's empowerment, but it's not. It's about gender parity, gender equality, and equity. So allow me to clarify this concept, and the concept goes like this. Gender equality in general involves equal status with equal rights, responsibilities, and opportunities to people of all gender identities. It takes into consideration the interests, needs, and priorities of people regardless of their gender identity. Gender equity recognizes that women and men have different lives, needs, and power, and that to be fair, impartial, and just, different steps need to be taken to create fair and equal outcomes. Okay. Gender equity may include equal treatment, or it may consist of treatment that is different but equivalent in terms of rights, benefits, obligations, and opportunities. Essentially, gender equity levels the playing field by creating circumstances through which gender equality can be achieved. Okay, if you look at this picture, you can see an example. Equality would be to give each participant one crate to stand on, but this is not true equality. It does not achieve our goal of allowing each one of them to benefit from development. Here, we know that some people need a little bit more crates, and some people need less. Of course, the term gender equity should be used with caution because it is a subjective term. When we say that we are exercising a fair treatment of women and men, we might inadvertently be perpetuating unequal gender relations or solidifying gender stereotypes that are detrimental to women. And it is for this reason that the term gender equality is preferred by the United Nations rather than gender equity. So let's now talk about ways of integrating gender, or what we call gender mainstreaming, into agricultural programs and projects. Here you see an example of the project cycle with gender mainstreaming. Gender mainstreaming in a project is actually making sure that both women's and men's needs are an integral part of the project cycle so that both can benefit and so that inequalities are not perpetuated. In order to do this, a gender approach needs to be employed in all phases of the project. If we look at the needs assessment here, like in any project, a baseline and needs assessment should be conducted. The baseline is important in order to be able to measure and evaluate the impact of the project or its interventions later on. The needs assessment is important in order to plan and design the project properly. With gender mainstreaming, gender disaggregated data is collected and analyzed together with the broader socioeconomic data that is collected and analyzed. Okay, and the gender analysis is performed. I will talk about that a little bit more in just a moment. I just want to say a few words about planning and design. In the last 20 years, since the Millennium Development Goals and through the Sustainable Development Goals, development agencies and governments have been pressured to include a gender agenda in all of their programs and projects. Often they do this in two ways. First of all, designating a percentage of women beneficiaries, a certain minimum, and secondly, by appointing a gender focal person. And I want to emphasize, these are great steps, but this is not enough, and this is not what gender mainstreaming means. Because when you just blindly assign a percentage of women beneficiaries, you might have unintended and sometimes even detrimental effects from the project. Let me give you an example. Supposing you come with a project of entrepreneurship to a community, and you are designating the project for women. Great. So now you're taking in the community all these women beneficiaries, and everybody says, the community says it's great, let's do it. But if you don't analyze what the women in the community, what their time constraints are, what their strengths and what their traditions are, you might be making a grave mistake. Maybe these women do not have the time to be entrepreneurs according to their daily schedule now. And if somebody else does not share with them the burden of their child care or homemaking tasks, then you are adding to them an extra burden that maybe they cannot fulfill. Another thing that you need to consider is that maybe they can fulfill it, and they will, and they'll do it very successfully, but maybe in this particular community or in this particular society, the money that is generated from the project will be given directly to the husbands or the fathers. In this case, the women will be working very hard as entrepreneurs or as beneficiaries of the project. Let's say it's an agricultural project, and so they are now working extra time in the field and or in the market. And in the end, when they do earn the money, do they get to enjoy it? And this is why you have to have a gender analysis. And this is why you need to know the situation of the community and of the beneficiaries before you begin the project. And designating a certain percentage of women beneficiaries is not enough. Regarding the gender focal person, this is fantastic, but again, this is not enough. Sometimes by designating a focal person, what you are doing is you are letting all the other staff members or decision makers in the project, you are letting them off the hook. What does that mean? You are compartmentalizing the gender issue, making it the issue of one person, and normally the gender focal person, or usually it is a woman, most of the cases, not always, and then it becomes something like, oh yeah, the women's stuff of the project, instead of being something that is integrated fully from start to finish as part of the project. Instead, what you need to do is you need to make sure that you have a very good gender balance in the staff of the project, and you need to make sure that everyone is on board and well trained when it comes to gender and gender integration into agricultural projects. Okay, and regarding implementation and monitoring, implementation, I'm going to talk about some suggested strategies. And as for monitoring and evaluation, then again, once again, you need to do another gender analysis, what is happening. And all of the findings must be mainstreamed back into the planning and design of the project in order to integrate for the following phases of the project. So when it comes to the needs assessment, you need to look at two kinds of needs that women have. You need to identify, of course, the constraints and the opportunities for both women and men. But what you need to do is you need to know that there are two kinds of needs. There are practical needs and strategic needs, and the project should try to address both of those needs. Practical needs are interventions that could make, addressing practical needs means interventions that make women's life easier. For example, making water more accessible to women. Strategic needs, on the other hand, are things that can empower women in the long term and eventually change mindsets. For example, capacity building or gender quotas in important committees within the project or within the community. When it comes to the gender analysis, a gender analysis is a critical study of the needs of women and men in the development process at all levels, as I said. It clarifies where inequity or inequality exists and it represents statistically who does what, who controls what, who decides what, who owns what, etc. It examines the relative influence of women and men in their home, as well as in their community, in markets, and it identifies their motivations and constraints. I like to say that gender analysis is a kind of research that is somewhere between intuition and science. When we talk about intuition, then yes, intuitively, we can all say that there are gender disparities or gender inequality, but let's prove it. Let's discuss it. Let's analyze it. And by doing a gender analysis, you know exactly what is happening in the community. And I'd like to give examples of how a gender analysis is done very briefly. For example, you can use a time use chart where you write in the hour, the tasks that are performed by women in the community, the total time that each task takes, the type of task it is, and same by men, and you can add here also by girls and boys in the community. This allows us to identify the time constraints and labor division of the families and the community. The second chart that you can use is an access and control for resources. This allows us to understand power relationships and gender roles in the community, and also to identify where the strengths and the constraints, where the bottlenecks, where the problems might be. So now, let's talk a little bit about the main constraints for women in agriculture. What are they? Well, they are many, and mainly they are constraints that are the gender norms that lead to inequality in the distribution of resources, like land, water, inputs and technologies, extension and advisory services, labor, including time, credit, markets, and social capital. So now, since time does not allow us to talk about all of the different strategies, I would like just to address some of the strategies that can be addressed when it comes to some of these different constraints. Poor access to land is often the single most important constraint limiting women's ability to benefit from agricultural development. Many countries have reformed, in the last 20 years, many countries have reformed their tenure laws. And for example, in 2012, Tanzania and the Philippines amended tenure laws to include explicit guarantees for women to own land in their own right, to inherit it equally to male heirs, and to buy and sell land without requiring the consent of male relatives. Many other countries as well. I just used these two examples. However, unfortunately, in many places, customary laws still prevail, regardless of what the written law says. And this is one of our biggest hindrances. Customary law is almost always male-dominated. In Ghana and Senegal, for example, tenure policies grant customary land authorities a very high degree of power in making land allocation decisions. Often, these authorities perpetuate patriarchal land allocation practices. In Bolivia and Nicaragua, despite very positive languages and land titling legislation regarding the equal rights of both men and women, resistance on the part of those responsible for implementing the program resulted in most of the land being titled eventually to men. No doubt, therefore, that there is a need to strengthen the land titling mechanisms and to implement greater checks and balances on customary authorities. Ethiopia, for example, adopted a program for low-cost, rapid, and transparent land certification, making land tenure accessible to poor, illiterate rural women, mainly female heads of households. Many other countries, such as Rwanda, Tanzania, and the Philippines, have worked to counteract this constraint by introducing gender quotas for local land administration committees. A good example of land reform happened in Guatemala with the Guatemala Land Reform Project, instituted since 1999 together with the World Bank. This project proved itself a gender success, with 52% of the land lease beneficiaries being women by 2010, And I think that this number has even increased since, but I was not able to find the latest data. Sorry about that. So the constraint really is the weak property and contractual rights to land, both statutory and customary. And so at the beginning, it's very important to identify the tenure status at the onset of the project. If possible, you need to strengthen property and contractual rights, even if it is just the rights to work the land, a certain plot, and to conduct legal literacy campaigns. Also, like in Ethiopia, this is a good example, you can apply low-cost, rapid, and transparent land certification, which is adapted to rural populations. And most of all, it's very important to ensure that women are represented in the land administration committees. Water is another great constraint. In many places in Africa and in India, women and girls fetch water in pots, buckets, and other containers which are carried on their head or their hip. A family of 5 people needs approximately 100 liters of water a day, weighing 100 kilo to meet its minimum needs. Women and children may need to walk to the water source 2 or 3 times each day. The first of these trips often takes place even before the dawn. During the dry season, in rural India and Africa, 30% or more of a woman's daily energy intake is spent fetching water. So women are the main users of water, but often they have restricted rights or difficulty to access water sources, clean water, acceptable water. Irrigation projects, on the other hand, often target male farmers. Rural women are particularly vulnerable also to climate change, which affects water availability. Regarding climate change, I think if I have time, I will say a few words in the end. So, what can we do? First of all, okay, we need to try to use the project's influence to increase water rights of women. We need to also use small-scale water management technologies, such as drip irrigation, to help women better manage the water that they have. And in this respect, we can also do small-scale irrigation, which is low-pressure drip irrigation. We can create, or we should create, and if they do not already exist, water users association, because there is more power in numbers, and also to ensure women's representation in existing associations. We can integrate irrigation and domestic water use, and this is a very good strategy because I'd like to give you an example from a project I accompanied in Senegal from 2013 to 2016. It was called the TIPA project. And it was a project for irrigated vegetable production. And we identified existing water drillings already equipped and managed by water users associations that provide villages with drinking water. The idea behind this was that the drinking water was considered a high priority by all, and therefore if the pump did break down, the whole community, even sometimes several villages together, would be involved in its repair. This was a lesson that we learned from a previous project that was geared for a group of 124 women in a different village who were unable to finance a new pump when their old one broke down. Since they were it wasn't just the pump actually, it was also to drill again another borehole, but they were not able to finance it. And so they worked the project and were very happy with it as long as everything was working. But when it broke down, they did not have any support from the community for the repair of the pump and to drill a new borehole, because they were the sole users of this water. Another one of the constraints that need to be addressed is the extension advisory services constraints. There's a lack of attention to gender in agricultural extension systems. Often, extension agents reach husbands, explain to them about a certain new method or a certain technique or some kind of a technology. And in fact, the person who needs to implement the action is the woman in the family. And so sometimes what happens is that the husband then goes and tries to explain what he learned to the wife, who needs to go and implement it. And a lot of the knowledge the information gets lost on the way. Also, there's a difference in how women receive and process information, and that needs to be addressed, and a lack of women agents in extension services. Here you see a picture of information. Information is great to get a lot of information, but knowledge is when you connect the dots and understand how they work together and how they fit in. So some of the key strategies would be to have more female extension workers, to train male extension agents to work with women, to ensure that extension messages are understandable to women, for example, considering their education level or their literacy level, to conduct farmer field schools, experiential learning, ICTs. I would like to stress that ICTs today is one of the best ways to directly get extension to women farmers. Also, it is important to understand how social networks can aid us in spreading the information, linking with churches or community groups or other networks that women trust. Here you can see it's from 2009, so it's a while ago, but I don't think it has changed all that much. Here you can see how much of the extension staff in India, Ghana, and Ethiopia are female. And you can see that not a lot. Here, you can see the access of heads of household, female heads of household compared to male heads of household in India in receiving extension services or livestock extension services. And you see that the disparities are huge, really huge. Another one of the constraints is time and labor, and relatively low productivity that we see in agriculture, in traditional agriculture, in most places in the world. So one of the things is that there are too many competing tasks. So women can only give as much time as they can to agriculture. So when they are, for example, cultivating plots of vegetables, well, if they need to water them manually, they can only grow a certain amount that they are able to feasibly, physically water every day. So again, here, labor-saving technologies that reduce women's time and energy burdens, but designed in a way that respects and enhances their roles is a possible answer. And I am a big fan of drip irrigation for many reasons. Okay. Finally, we have the services and supports infrastructure with a big constraint that is there's the exclusion of women. So the question is, what can we do? And here, the project has a very important task and role, and that is to organize and empower women to increase their control of projects and the benefits of the projects. And it is very important to do that from the outset, because if you wait and things are not clear and agreed upon from the beginning, when the project is successful and the money starts coming in, you might find that you have a lot of people grumbling and then trying to maybe push aside the women beneficiaries. It happens. So try to organize and empower the women from the onset, and to maybe cement their control of the project benefits before the benefits even come in. It's advised to form mixed sex groups for greater group effectiveness, because if you get the men of the community on board, you will have a lot more support for your project. So if you do that, but you have to also promote mechanisms that ensure that women's active participation. I remember that in the project in Senegal, the first let's say the first time that we had a group meeting, all of the men came and sat in the front on the plastic chairs that were set out, and the women sat in the back on on the ground or on the stoop that was nearby. And they did that sort of automatically. It was sort of like an accepted thing. To me, as a stranger, I didn't really know exactly how to react when I saw it, because I said, okay, to me, it's not okay that they are sitting in the back there. But on the other hand, what am I going to do? I'm a white stranger coming into their village. What am I going to tell them? That it's not okay? How to do it, do it. But then again, you need to put in institutional mechanisms that ensure that the women do have active participation, that they are not shy about talking, and for that you need technical and leadership training to the women. They need to be very adept technically. For example, if I'm going to use again an irrigation example, if the project is for irrigated vegetables and you have irrigation systems, you need to make sure that the women receive just as much training, and maybe even sometimes more training, on using irrigation systems, modern irrigation systems, drip systems. And but it's not enough for them to be adept technically. You also need to give them leadership training so that they know how to perform their roles effectively in the groups, within the groups. Also, you need to time the meetings to accommodate women's workloads. You need to ensure that all men and women have the opportunities to attend the meetings, and also to voice their opinions. And when you reach the monitoring and evaluation stage, you must not forget to solicit women's input and find out how project is working for them. So in conclusion, to get the right answers, you must start by asking the right questions. If you do that, if you answer the right questions, if you ask the right questions, then you will be able to seek out the answers that you need. So what are the different roles and stakes of women and men in the project? How will the project affect them? Will both men and women realistically be able to participate and to benefit? And how might differential participation of men and women affect program activities and impact? How can the project contribute in the end to gender equity and equality and reduce gender disparities? Let's see, do we have time? What time is it? To escape here. Sorry. Stop share. Hi. Okay, can you all hear me?
Yes.
If you can hear me, please nod.
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Great. So we have just a few more. We have a few minutes. I do want to say something that relates back to the COVID-19, since this is the times that we are living in, and I'd like to connect it to the issue of climate change and disasters in general. Because the FAO, the State of Food and Security and Nutrition in the World, said that world hunger is on the rise. And it's partly due to climate change related factors, as I said, related to erratic rainfall, extreme heat, the spread of pests, climate disasters. Okay, not every climate change effect is a disaster, but some of them really are, including droughts and floods and storms, some of them with immediate tragic effects, such as loss of lives and displacement, and sometimes with ongoing effects, such as reduced agricultural productivity. Causing, of course, food shortages, higher food prices, income loss, etc. Between 1990 and 2016, there was an average of 213 extreme climate events per year, and women have been the disproportionate sufferers of such events. And I think that maybe we will have a special webinar on the issue of climate change. I don't want to make any promises, but this is our plan. So keep tuned to us, and we will try to give you more information on that. But I do want to say this, that women are most vulnerable, not only to climate change, not only to climate change disaster, but also to disaster in general. For example, if you look at the statistics between 2010 and 2015, 20 million out of 26 million people who were displaced due to climate change disaster were women. 20 million out of 26 million. So this is incredible. And the reason that women are most vulnerable is that they, more than their male counterparts, lack the resources and knowledge necessary for withstanding, mitigating, or adapting. But now I'd like to, and when there are such disasters, then we also find that gender-based violence rises. First for women who are displaced and who are most vulnerable, but also for women within the household. And this is the same not only for climate disaster, but for disaster in general. And I'd like now to talk about the COVID-19 connection, and that is that we see here, and we do not yet have all of the data or all of the statistics, but we see here that in Israel, that there's been a 20% increase in calls for emergency hotlines. In France, for example, Interior Minister Christophe Castaner acknowledged that since the closure in France, domestic violence has risen by 30%. In Brazil, the Liga 180 hotline reported an 18% increase in inquiries in 1 week in March. In Turkey, nonprofits report 30% increase in women's complaints against their husbands. In the UK, the National Anti-Abuse Line has reported a 25% increase in the number of referrals since the outbreak of the epidemic. In Chile, the Domestic Violence Association has drafted a feminist emergency plan for the coronavirus period. And of course, like I said, we do not have the exact statistics, but the trend is clear. And furthermore, all experts agree that the number of reported cases is probably just the tip of the iceberg. So since many severe violence cases are not reported, because in the confinement, men are present in the home and they may prevent their wives from using the phone or seeking help on the internet. In this context, there is an urgent need for greater and continuous efforts to address gender inequalities and increase women's access to financial resources, land, education, information, health, advisory service, and other basic human rights. It is also crucial to overcome women's social exclusion from decision-making processes and the labor markets, so that they can better cope and adapt with all kinds of crises, climate change and other crises. Special provisions and investments in cash, time, and labor are also needed to introduce innovative adaptation practices, which are too costly for households with poor access to credit or few working adults. So that's the end of the presentation, and I'd like now to take some questions. Omer, do we have questions?
Yes, we have some questions. We have a question regarding the legislation. Does legislation help in reducing gender disparity?
Of course. Yeah, it's a great question. Of course, legislation helps. But like I mentioned with the land tenure laws, and that was just an example, legislation is only the first step, or only one of the steps necessary. It is a first and very crucial step, very important, but it needs to be carried through with implementation. Structural mechanisms need to be put in place in order to make sure that, that the law is actually implemented, because there is a huge disparity between what is written in most countries' laws. Today, most of the countries have adopted, at least to some extent, more gender equal legislation, but custom and tradition and religion and other social factors are often a hindrance for those laws to be carried through.
All right, thank you. We have another question from Ethiopia. I hope I'm pronouncing it correct, from Miss Yetchale. Regarding the pandemic time, how can we assure gender equality during pandemic? There's the example that in Ethiopia there were happening raping and illegal sexual intercourse. So how, in your opinion, can interventions be done?
Yeah. During the pandemic, as you saw from the examples I gave from many places around the world, and I'm sure that these were just examples and there are many other examples too, you see that when we enter times of crisis, often it's the women that suffer. For example, when there's a food shortage, usually in a family, the first to deprive herself from food is the woman, is the wife, the mother. The second to be deprived is usually the girl children, and then the boy children, and last the husband. But okay, this is a generalization. It's maybe not the same everywhere, but this is a trend that is known. So in the pandemic, yes, there are a lot of problems and difficulties that are being seen. And I think that the way of preventing these situations is year-round or everyday constant awareness campaigns, and trying to sensitize communities and societies on a daily basis when there is no crisis. And then that way, when crisis does hit, then we will see less cases of femicide, less cases of domestic violence, less cases of disparities. We see sometimes, for example, in the time of an extreme weather event, climate event, for example, that when supplies are in short, unavailable, for example, and sometimes let's say a truck will come with some supplies, then only the strongest can actually get to the truck and grab supplies for themselves. And sometimes it's not necessarily the women. I mean, I'm not saying that sometimes it is, but normally they are not as strong. Or so the things that these phenomenon that we see in the pandemic are things that the base for them has already been set up before the onset of the pandemic. And so we need to constantly have awareness campaigns and sensitization on gender equality in the society, through schools, through public awareness campaigns, in order to be more resilient during crisis.
Thank you. Another question from Mevayero. How can we ensure integration into agricultural activities that are dominated by males, such as agricultural mechanization?
Okay, yeah. Sometimes it's hard to get even the women to volunteer sometimes for things that are highly mechanized. But I think the way to do it is by trying to ensure that the men also enjoy the new technology or the mechanization or the intervention that you are proposing. And if they are also beneficiaries, they will adopt it or welcome it, whether or not there are also women enjoying the intervention. So if you include men and women, then you are also increasing your chances of success by ensuring that you have a broader support for this intervention, even if it's something like you said about mechanization, where it's usually male dominated. I hope that answers the question.
An interesting question from Benson. How is land tenure system in Israel is regarded to gender?
Okay, the land tenure system in Israel is that the land is considered belonging to the state. And when you have a farm, you are not allowed to do what you want with the land on the farm. For example, if it is designated agricultural land, then you can only use it for agriculture. In any case, the farm cannot be split up in any way, and you must designate one heir. It could be a son, a daughter, it could be someone else, but you need to designate your heir, one person. If you do not designate an heir, then it's usually your oldest child who is the first, or if one of the farmers die, then it is their spouse, for sure. But if then the spouse dies, then it would be the oldest child if they did not designate. Normally, what people do is they come to an agreement within the family on how, who is going to continue, because farming is a difficult activity, and you do not always have like your oldest child who wants to continue and be a farmer. So sometimes it's one of your children, let's say, and then that child, in order to inherit the farm, because it's only one person who can inherit the farm, needs to maybe compensate his brothers and sisters or her brothers and sisters in some way for the fact that the farm belongs, is under their name. The other ones maybe can also benefit from the farm's income, but there's only one person who can inherit it. And like I said, with the land tenure, it's the land itself belongs to the state. The farm belongs to you. I hope that answered your question.
Yes, I think so. Hopefully. Last question is regarding financial access. There are some countries that bank laws requires the husband's signature when women is married. So how do you see the ability for women to have financial access to engage in agricultural activities?
Yes. In the last 20 years, this has been a hot topic. A lot of microcredit agencies, organizations, a lot of measures put into place through different international projects and development projects, and it is very important. I think a lot of states have reformed this legislation, but again, in order to be dealing with a bank, you need to be literate. You need to not only be literate, but you also have to have the confidence to be able to read and to understand what a bank contract is when it comes to credit or microcredit. So sometimes the solution is to have local microcredit setups, sometimes within the village. But today we also have another very good solution for that, and that is through the ICTs, through different applications and programs, Orange Money and so on, to be able to access some credit in other ways, maybe detouring the actual traditional banking systems.
Yes. Thank you very much, Tammy. It was enlightening.
So thank you all very much. I enjoyed being with you, and I hope to see you on our next webinar. Thank you very much. All the best.
I only want to, there were some questions regarding the recording. The recording will be available on our YouTube channel, so stay tuned, please. Thank you very much, Tammy.
Okay, thank you.